I'm a bit of an overthinker, but I'm pretty sure most of us listening are as well. We want to know the right ways to think, and we're also haunted by past mistakes. It doesn't matter who remembers that we made them. All that counts is that we know that they happened, and are terrified by the thought of inconveniencing a person for even a moment. Unfortunately, however, even though we're smart enough to know that our actions have an effect on others, what we might sadly be oblivious to are the really important ones to learn. The moments where nobody judges us, because they understand if they were in our situation, they would act the exact same way. Now, I empathize with the struggle in rewriting someone's brain chemistry, as well as the fears that led us to the point of not wanting to talk to anyone. Speaking from a place of personal experience, there are two fears that I had that caused me to hesitate to talk to others, which were then eased as I not only came to understand the consequences of living in fear, but the realization that I was making a big deal out of nothing. Now, one reason is because we don't want to make others uncomfortable, and the other is because we don't want to deal with the social consequences of embarrassing ourselves. Both of them are equally valid, but like I said before, these are reasons that have kept me from finding happiness. If I haven't said it yet in this series, I want to remind everyone that we're much harder on ourselves than others are on us. That even if people make fun of us for a couple of minutes for failing, what we desire is no different from what any other human would want. And that desire is companionship, whether it's romantic or platonic. Regarding the first reason, it's important to understand the expectations that others have for themselves, as well as the ones that they have for us. And as 75% of Americans are afraid of public speaking, as many young people nowadays are facing an epidemic of loneliness, not many people are properly positioned to judge us for having the bravery to leave our hearts exposed. It's a fair assumption that those who might otherwise judge us know the pain of loneliness or the bravery required to make the first move, regardless of our intentions. And so nobody worth paying attention to is going to hold our vulnerability against us. Now, this is going to sound disconnected at first, but I promise it'll loop back in a second. I've been listening to K-pop for a few years, and as I've listened, I've heard a prevailing sentiment on a couple of songs that I've listened to, particularly Cheshire by ITZY and Scientist by Twice. Now, you know what they say. Once is an accident, but twice is a coincidence. No pun intended. Even though social interaction can feel like doing quadratic equations sometimes, we would do very well to keep in mind that men and women operate very heavily on vibes. Even though I understand the nasty habit of overcomplicating simple interactions, thinking that we have to move mountains in order to be seen, sometimes there's beauty in small gestures. If we're introducing ourselves first, constantly smiling, making jokes, lifting each other up, and even lightheartedly alluding to our mistakes as they happen, then we should have relatively little issue, even if being the first person to approach is scary. And while each circumstance depends on the individual's desire to either converse or forge relationships, rest easy that most people aren't so cruel as to think of our very existence as a burden. Even if interacting with others is as scary as we built up in our heads, it's not like we're spoiled for options as to what to do about it. Even though we always have the option to let fear rule over us, we've likely felt the consequences of comfort at one point or another. I know this because it's happened to me before. We become so strung up in what might be that we cost ourselves valuable opportunities, purely because we don't know what steps to take when approaching others, let alone what will happen if we take them. And on that front I can empathize. Shoot, I would be a rich man if I had $1 for every time fear of rejection kept me from asking a girl out. Overthinking, fear of being judged, and thoughts that people were merely tolerating my existence all made having a romantic life an uphill battle at the best of times. In my youth, rejection was a foregone conclusion in the few times that I was brave enough to ask. So it's sadly understandable that by the time I was a senior in high school, I barely even bothered attempting to ask girls on a date. And yet, fate still forced me to stare down the barrel of desire. From the moment that I sat down and saw a girl in my social studies class, my senior year of high school, I could tell that I had a crush on her. Unfortunately, when a guy or girl aren't brave enough to approach someone they have a crush on due to social anxiety, the apple of their eye just moves on. Going back to the real-life example that I alluded to earlier, I sat across from her for 8 months and spent 7 months saying absolutely nothing, causing life to pass me by, too afraid to say anything. I take comfort in the thought that I'm better about approaching people now than I was back then, as being dragged to the club by my friends has acted as a sort of exposure therapy for me, but I still think every now and again about what would have happened if I wasn't so afraid of being the subject of high school gossip or being rejected, to the point where I let whispers of others hold me back from approaching someone that I was interested in. Not everything has to revolve around social circles, however. Where are all my fellow inventors, the victims of the passion project to postpartum depression pipeline, as I call it? This is a safe space, I promise. We can all be honest and say that we overthink our creative works. It doesn't matter if our canvas is filled with words, colors, or colorful words. If I was a gambling man, I would wager that we all know the burden of the creative well. Endless revisions without ever pushing our work into the wild. Similar to the reason we hesitate to approach others, often these nerves are born from a fear of a scrutinizing public. As a consequence, we constantly question ourselves and rework all of the imperfections out of it. Such is understandable if we spent months to years working on a project, but getting too caught up in the imperfections of one's work dooms the labor of our love to be lost to time. As my family and friends remind me constantly, it's better to have a flawed masterpiece than to be forgotten by history. I might not have mentioned this yet, but in addition to writing, I rap in my free time, and I have a song called Perfect, which hasn't released yet, where I say the words, "No matter how deep the depths of our perception, we only find death in the depths of perfection." With that in mind, I find it both fascinating and comforting. Even some of the greatest creative minds of the past 20-30 years don't always think about other people when they're writing their works. Sometimes, it's something that they simply make for themselves, or it's something that they desired existed, regardless of how many people enjoy it. One example is Hayao Miyazaki, who said in an interview with Pete Docter that he doesn't think about his audience at all when making his work. And even though I'm not so established that people are going to flock to my work regardless, I see the value in writing from a place of personal catharsis. I'm going to talk in a couple videos about using art to bring closure to a part of our lives, but for now, we can find peace in knowing that we don't have to worry so much about the perfection of our art. All this to say, there's no shame in getting lost in the heat of passion. Even though I know I think too much, I'm well aware of the positive effects that are yielded from letting our fears go. If our love burns like a fire, then our enthusiasm will not only shine like twilight, but once the hardest part is over with, taking the first step will attract people to stoke the flame. So long as we envelop our creations and our loved ones in our care, we'll want for nothing in terms of personal satisfaction and close connections. We may stumble at first, but as love propels us to get better at understanding others and producing our creations, that once taboo lack of thought becomes something we never expected would become a boon.